Genesis chapter 22 is held up as one of the great stories of the Old Testament. For the Jews it is known as the binding of Isaac, and is commonly seen as a test of Abraham's faith. For Christians it's known as the sacrifice of Isaac. The early church fathers, desperate to find signs of their newly invented Christ and Trinity in the Old Testament, saw in the binding of Isaac elements which they could tie to the Jesus myth, the sacrifice, the faith, and not least the substitute lamb. It is also seen as a myth or legend which explains or perhaps supports the rejection of human sacrifice, which was widely practiced in ancient times. In this story, the child sacrifice is replaced by an animal sacrifice. In the Bible context, this is of course ridiculous. The God who can tell Abraham to move his people hundreds of miles without question, and lop off the end of everyone's knobs without question, is quite capable of telling Abraham to stop burning his children alive without the need for any elaborate drama, and without the need to replace the torching of kids with pointless, barbaric and wasteful torching of livestock. Abraham, who had followed all God's commands thus far, had full knowledge of the flood and personal experience of Sodom and Gomorrah, hardly needed a three-act play to explain the benefits of doing what the big cheese said. Personally, I find this chapter expressive of all that is wrong in the blind faith with which believers accept the stories of the Bible as presented to them without question. So let's jump in and review it. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. Why would an omniscient God need to tempt or test anyone? The God who knows everything would always have known what Abraham's reaction would be under any set of circumstances, would in fact know Abraham's every thought and every possible thought. So the idea that God needs to test anything is absurd. On the other hand, when God tempts Abraham, he is subverting Abraham's free will. Abraham has already accepted God as the big I am, and he has seen the wrath of God against those who do not follow his orders in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. If, as we are now taught, whatever God decides is good becomes our objective morality, then Abraham would have to follow God's upcoming command, both out of fear and because it was objectively moral for him to do so. This is coercion of the ultimate kind. What place is there here for free will? As we are continually told by the apologists, God cannot lie. What is it that God is doing when he tells Abraham to take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of? One definition of a lie is that which is grossly deceptive. I would argue that this qualifies as a lie. You may disagree. So what does Abraham do? Does he debate with God the merits of sacrificing his only son, as he had at length debated concerning the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah? No. Does he discuss the situation with his wife and Isaac's mother, Sarah? No. Sarah has done all that is required of women in the Bible. She has copulated, gestated, and faded into the background. Nope, Abraham obeys God without pause or question. He took 2 of his young men and Isaac, plus the wood for the sacrifice, and walked for 3 days to the place God had indicated. He tells the 2 men to wait with the donkey, loads Isaac up with the wood for the sacrifice. He took a fire and a knife, and they headed up the mountain. We don't know for certain how old Isaac is here, from the Bible text, but it is accepted that he was not a young kid, with suggested ages ranging from 15 all the way up to 37. Isaac carried the wood up the mountain. This wasn't a handful of kindling. If you're going to burn an animal as a sacrifice, then you need a funeral pyre. Isaac was most certainly at least a young man. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. It must be remembered that this was a ritualistic sacrifice, and as we all know, in a ritual, every step of the process is carefully choreographed. Abraham built an altar first, and laid the wood in order second. Luckily, in Leviticus we have more detail concerning burnt offerings. And the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And practically, of course, this makes sense. You would not pile up enough sticks to burn a lamb and then set light to them. You set the fire first and then build the wood pyre on top of it. But we're to believe that a strapping young man, who had already questioned where the lamb for the sacrifice was, meekly allows his centenarian father to tie him up and put him on an already burning funeral pyre. Am I the only one who cannot for a moment picture that scene passing without comment or struggle from Isaac? And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven. Hold on a moment. The angel of the Lord? This is why you need to be careful when you read your Bible. Let us recap a moment. This is the first mention of Lord in chapter 22. Up until now it's been God all the way. It was God, Elohim, who tempted Abraham, and God Elohim throughout, to the point where Abraham raises his knife, when suddenly we have Lord, Yahweh, enter the text. Could it be that the text has been tweaked here? The documentary hypothesis suggests that the Elohist source comes from the kingdom of Israel, and the Yahwist source originates in the kingdom of Judah. Did this story continue in a different vein in the original Elohist source? Do we have any other clues? I think we do. As we read forward into Isaac's story, we'll find no further mention of Elohim. Isaac's story is a Yahwist source. In the Elohist story, Isaac's last scene is here on the sacrificial altar. If we look ahead to Isaac's story, which is only the single chapter 26 of Genesis, as opposed to the dozen chapters devoted to Abraham, we see some curious things. Chapter 26 starts with a great famine which forces Isaac to travel south, just as Abraham did when he first arrived in Canaan. Isaac does not go to Egypt, as Abraham did, but to Abimelech's land of Gerar, as Abraham did on his second wife-swapping expedition. And just as Abraham had, Isaac tries to pass off his wife as his sister and gets caught. Isaac then redigs the same wells which Abraham had earlier dug, and even has God, Yahweh, appear to him and tell him about all the descendants he will have. Could it be that the Isaac story we have is simply a duplicate of the Abraham story, pasted in at a later date, and that in the original story Abraham did indeed sacrifice his firstborn son, as was common in the area at the time and is evidenced by several passages in the Bible and the Levitical laws prohibiting the practice? Remember that the Jewish law is the law of Moses. Abraham's story is one of turning away from paganism and polytheism and embracing monotheism. It would be fully understandable for Abraham's actions to be contrary to Mosaic law, like marrying his sister, having a concubine, sacrificing his firstborn. But perhaps later scribes, elevating Abraham to the status of patriarch, thought that last practice not worthy of someone who was going to be set up as an example for all. So Abraham barbecues the ram instead because, as we know, the metaphysical God does enjoy the very physical process of smelling burnt meat. God then says, "Well done" to Abraham for trying to sacrifice his son, and then, "So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba." I encourage you to read the Abraham story again from the end of chapter 11. You will see that no name is wasted. When someone is named, it is to tell the audience that they are important in the events to come. When they are only referred to in the third person, he, him, she, her, it is indicative that they are fading from the story. See particularly Hagar and Isaac's exit scenes. And here, in Genesis 22:19, we have Abraham returning to his young men. There is no mention of Isaac whatsoever. 2 men went up the mountain, but only one came down. Thanks for watching.